I am curious, would you be willing to say goat versus fish with goat versus fish? Would you be willing to say it with goat
like
versus
at the same
fish?
time?
Yes.
Okay. Sure. Hold on 1 sec. I'm just trying to make sure these levels are right.
Yes.
I don't want you to lose my voice in your voice. Can goat versus fish say goat versus fish real quick?
Goat versus fish.
Perfect. That's great. Okay. How are you gonna give us like a countdown or something? Or are you gonna
It shall be goat versus fish.
That's the countdown?
Yes.
And then we say goat versus fish?
Yes. Then we say goat versus fish. It shall be goat versus fish. Yes?
Yeah. Okay. No, sure.
Goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish. Oh, okay. We got the same rhythm too, I assume, right?
Yes. Okay. It can be as you wish to say it. How do you wish to say it?
No. I want to make sure this is your podcast, man. I want to make sure we get this right.
It shall be goat versus fish.
Okay.
Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish. The goat fish. And goat versus fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. Welcome to the Goat vs. Fish podcast, in which we shall speak of the verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. You are within the verses of Goat vs. Fish, and the verses of Goat vs. Fish are within you. You have many questions, yes? Who is Goat vs. Fish? What is Goat vs. Fish? Why is Goat vs. Fish? But there is only one question. Are you goat or are you fish? Ponder it now. Who shall triumph, the goat or the fish? Let us find out on this verses of Goat versus Fish. Comedy Store. Comedy Store. The world-famous Comedy Store, some do call it. It is a place of Goat versus Fish, a place of many verses of Goat versus Fish, and even the Goat versus Fish podcast. But not just Goat versus Fish. Many goat and fish do come to that Comedy Store place to dispense their own humorous verses, spreading their own verses of goat and fish, and even a fence-sitter. Goat vs. Fish first verses at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, at the mighty verses of Show Up, Go Up. There, Goat vs. Fish verses with Goat Sarah Kenny, Fish Mark the Shark Stevens, and fence-sitter Al Bamani, who, strangely like the Michael Allen one, does not choose goat or fish, and yet does spread the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish did verses at the Comedy Store on the 253rd verses of Killing Tony. And on that same verses did share verses at the Mondayly verses of Potluck, where all ones can try their verses, try to get a chance to speak their verses at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, yes. On the 268th verses of Killing Tony, a goat, or is it a fish trapped within a goat? Malcolm Hatchett did wear Goat vs. Fish upon the very top of it. And so, though it did not appear in the beginning of the verses of Kill Tony that it would be Goat vs. Fish, it was still Goat vs. Fish. You can hear more about Goat vs. Fish, Goat Malcolm Hatchett, and the killing of Tony on the 19th and 32nd verses of the Goat vs. Fish podcast. And just last verses, Goat vs. Fish appeared again at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. having come first from the verses of Anime Expo, where fish did triumph. Oh, how the fish did triumph. Oh, we celebrate fishly triumph, yes. Goat vs. Fish returned to the Comedy Store Los Angeles to spread the verses. Goat vs. Fish shall soon spread those verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles to you, listening goat and fish, and fence sitters. But first, let us acknowledge a new place of Goat vs. Fish. You see, Goat vs. Fish wished, of course, to record these very Comedy Store verses at the place of the Comedy Store Los Angeles itself. But Goat vs. Fish records there on Sunday verses, and the verses of Comedy Store were on Monday verses, and Goat vs. Fish podcast is spread on the Wednesday verses. So Goat vs. Fish had to find another place to record Goat vs. Fish, so you could hear the Comedy Store verses as soon as versesable. This verses of the Goat vs. Fish podcast, that does celebrate the Comedy Store Los Angeles, is recorded at the place of one that is called... What is that one called again? What is this one called?
You can just call me Ericson.
We can just call it Ericson. Thank you, one that is just called Ericson. We just call it Ericson. We celebrate this one Ericson that welcomes Goat vs. Fish. Celebration! Celebration! Are you goat or fish?
Let's not go there.
Ah, it is a fence sitter. Oh, it is a fence sitter. Oh, it sits on the fence, and yet it too welcomes Goat vs. Fish. It too welcomes Goat vs. Fish. Thank you for welcoming Goat vs. Fish to speak here, though you do sit on the fence. Goat vs. Fish does wish to celebrate you now, Why do you not tell the ones who listen something of yourself and how it is that you verses in this place? Do you not have a verses of your very own that you record in this very place? Tell the ones, fence sitter.
Yeah, if anybody wants to check out my podcast, where I interview people that I know, stand-up comedians and baristas, about my favorite subject myself, you can find it at Just Ericson. That's JOSTERICSON. Or just follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Just Ericson. You can find me pretty much anywhere at Just Ericson.
Thank you for these verses. Thank you for these verses, Just Ericson, fence sitter. Goat vs. Fish has even noticed that you who listen, can hear the fence sitter Michael Allen CPA on the podcast of one Just Ericson on the April 12th, 2018 verses of the Just Ericson podcast. But do not be tempted by its false verses. Do not be tempted by its false verses if it claims to be Goat vs. Fish. Celebration for one. Celebration for the fence sitter that we just call Ericson. Subscribe to the Just Ericson podcast on the iTunes just as you subscribe to Goat vs. Fish with the same verses that you subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. We shall start soon now. We shall soon start to know the verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and oh, it is a mighty verses. You cannot wait for these verses. You cannot wait for these verses, Goat and Fish. But did you know that you can see evidence of the very verses of which Goat vs. Fish will speak on the Goat vs. Fish Instantgram at Goat vs. Fish at GoatVsFish? You will not see each and every verses that Goat vs. Fish will speak of this verses. Some, pitiably, do not wish to be on the Goat vs. Fish Instantgram, though they do follow Goat vs. Fish. Go to the Goat vs. Fish Instantgram, follow Goat vs. Fish, and search for the hashing tag Comedy Store Verses. That's Comedy Store Verses, and you shall find visages of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and Goat and Fish, and Goat vs. Fish to aid in your ponderings of this verses of the Goat vs. Fish podcast. The verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. The verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. When we last left Goat and Fish at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, it was after a mighty verses with one comedian, Brett Ericson. That one pondered Goat vs. Fish. Oh, how it pondered Goat vs. Fish. It spoke to Goat vs. Fish. It even chose Goat or Fish. But for you to know if it is a goat or fish, you must subscribe and continue to listen to the Goat vs. Fish podcast. One Brett Ericson, at I Brett my pants, shall be on future verses. After that verses of one Brett Ericson, Goat and Fish did verses at the Anime Expo, yes? Mighty and exhausting though it was, Goat and Fish were ready to verses again. They hungered for verses. They thirsted for verses. Goat, still reeling from the Fish triumph at Anime Expo, sought new verses to prove, Goat. Fish, ever prepared to defend its triumph from the Goat. So Goat, leaping from the highest land of the Goat, Fish speeding through the deepest sea of the Fish. Goat and Fish meet at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and the verses was mighty. Oh yes, the verses was mighty. It would seem it would be forever Goat versus Fish. It would be forever Goat versus Fish. And it was Goat versus Fish. But just then, just outside the front of the verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, one appeared before Goat vs. Fish, one who had never yet heard the verses of Goat vs. Fish. "Are you goat or are you fish?" said Goat vs. Fish, asking the one true question. "Technically, I'm a goat," the one said. The Goat said, and so Goat brought technical verses to the Fish. The Fish tried to outmaneuver Goat, but the technical verses of the Goat, so precise with its technicalness, of its hooves and its horns, Goat did triumph over Fish. And it was one verses for Goat. Pitiably, this verses was not evidenced. But trust Goat versus Fish, it did happen just as Goat versus Fish says. A complete triumph for technical Goat. But just Ericson then, one called Willie Simon at Trilly Fly Mon, called out to Goat versus Fish, eager to join the verses. "Are you goat or fish?" "I am fish," said the Fish, and now the verses was fishy. "How do you versus the Goat? Aggressive verses, said the Fish. Fish could not out-technical the technical Goat, but rebuked technical Goat with a veritable stream of aggressive verses. The aggression of the Fish was so aggressive. Fish. Technical Goat could not withstand the Fish. Oh, the Fish did triumph, and it was one verses for Fish. Goat versus Fish continued to verses about, leaving the entering place of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, tumbling through the land and the sea out to the side verses. Goat versus Fish found another one. "Are you goat or are you fish?" The one called Matt Graves at Betwixt 138. A ginger one, it calls itself, had a similar fur to the Goat of Goat vs. Fish and recognized Goat within itself. "I'm Goat," said the Goat, and it was off to the verses again. Goat, realizing the technical verses were no longer triumphant, studied the aggressive Fish even as it triumphed over Goat. But with the aid of new Goat, Goat took aggressive verses right back to the Fish. It was a mutually aggressive verses, and it seemed none would triumph, but then a nearby Goat joined the verses, followed by a Fish. With 2 Goat for Goat and 1 Fish for Fish, the aggressiveness of the Goat did out-aggressive the Fish, and it was triumph for Goat. It was triumph for Goat with a mighty headbutting of the Goat, with a mighty headbutting of a second Goat. And that Goat did follow Goat versus Fish, Land and sea, all about the Goat and Fish, as it versed onward. No end to be seen, such a glorious forever verses, but then Goat versus Fish came across another one. This one calls itself MBN, at Made by NASA, it does call itself. So aggressive the verses! Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? It was a fence sitter. Ooh, it was a fence sitter. Fence sitter MBN proclaims on its Instagram that all my dreams are for real. But that seems to be the only proclamation it is making, for it is not proclaiming goat or fish. It is not proclaiming goat or fish. The fence, sitting between aggressive technical goat and aggressive fish, interferes with the verses, interferes with the very verses of Goat versus Fish. Get off the fence, cried Goat and Fish and Goat versus Fish, but there it sits, and you can see it sitting on the fence, on the Goat versus Fish Instantgram, if you dare. The fence it sits upon prevents it from speaking goat or fish, prevents it from proclaiming goat or fish. But even that fence-sitter did follow Goat versus Fish, and for this we celebrate, for this we do celebrate. But not as much as if it had joined the verses as goat or fish. One Just Ericson, how are you enjoying these verses?
I'm really gonna blow my nose. Just hold on one sec. I'm going to the bathroom real quick. I'll be right back. I was literally holding that in for like a long time. Like pretty much when we just started. Anyway. Sorry about that. That's pretty unprofessional, but I appreciate, you asking. We're good. Continue.
Goat and Fish did despair. Goat and Fish did despair, for the fence-sitter had interrupted an otherwise spectacular verses with its fenciness. But they did not despair for long. Oh, they did not despair for long, for along came yet another one. Comedian One Kristen Lundberg. Comedian One Kristen Lundberg at Mammy Spanks, with an X it did call itself. One that spreads the verses of Goat versus Fish has spread its verses with Goat versus Fish before at other comedy places. Goat and Fish believed that they could trust this one to deliver fish and goat from the fenciness of the fence. Are you goat, or are you fish? It is a goat, it is a goat. And the Lundberg goat cried out, I seek the unity of goat and fish. I seek the goat fish. Goat felt goat with this goat. Goat felt goat with the goat. But now it was up to fish. So pleased to be free from the pointiness and the pointlessness of the fence. Agreed to form the unity of the goat fish with the goat. The unity of goat fish. The unity of goat fish. But the aggressiveness had not left goat entirely, for it was an aggressive kissing unity of goat and fish. Fish could not believe the continued aggressiveness of the kissing goat, but it did kiss the goat as a fish, and oh, it was goat fish. It was very versesly goat fish. Goat Kristen Lundberg went on to verses at the 276th verses of Killing Tony. Just that very verses, representing goat. You should witness that goat. You should witness that goat. Are you goat or are you fish? Goat versus Fish, asked one comedian actor, Julian Tiskuna. Tshikuna. At Julian Tiskuna, who was pleased to witness Goat versus Fish and did smile at Goat versus Fish. It was a goat. It was another goat. Goat versus Fish did ask it if it was goat or fish. But this goat still felt the unity of goat and fish so much that it was confused as to how to versus the fish, even going so far as to ask the ones that was with it how to versus the fish. But Goat versus Fish reminded that goat that the verses must come from within, and come from within they did. Goat-fish unity it was still, and the Julian Tiskuna goat did feed the grass of the land to the fish, and oh, what pleasant verses are these. And so the fish consumed from the very land of the goat. Amazing verses, amazing verses. A rare verses for fish to consume the grass of the land. Tiskuna goat. It almost sounds like tuna goat. Perhaps that is why it is so fond of feeding the land grass to the fish. But when would goat and fish versus again? When would it be goat versus fish? frolicking and swimming deeper down the Comedy Store Los Angeles. The grass of the land, in the belly of the fish, it was on towards the place that is called the Belly Room, where GoatVsFish did first speak at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Suddenly, one Dan Britton, at Dan of Britain, excitedly approached the GoatFish and said, "In the beginning, there was GoatVsFish." Yes, oh yes, it did recite the very verses of GoatVsFish directly to GoatVsFish, the GoatFish. Wise in the verses, so wise in the verses, singing celebrations of GoatVsFish, and how fond one Dan Britton is of GoatVsFish, that GoatVsFish, the GoatFish, was so pleased to ask, "Are you goat, or are you fish?" But it was another fence sitter. Oh, it was another fence sitter. GoatVsFish has heard from the Alex Hooperly fence sitter on the 23rd and 33rd verses of the GoatVsFish podcast that some fence sitters sit on the fence in reverence of GoatVsFish. You can also see the Alex Hooperly one in a mighty roasting verses of Americans Get Talents on the YouTube. But in any verses, here was an evidence of such a fence-sitter that sat on the fence and yet knew the verses of GoatVsFish and was pleased to celebrate them, even as it sat on the fence. The fence-sitter may celebrate GoatVsFish. Oh yes, it can be done, it can be done. But even the most pleasant celebratory fence-sitter, even the fence-sitter that welcomes GoatVsFish to record the GoatVsFish podcast in the place of its very verses, still sits on the fence. It was not feeling Goatfish. It was not feeling GoatVsFish. It was all fence-sitterly verses, fence-sitterly verses. Goat and Fish had had enough fancy verses and frolicked and swam back to the front of the verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Curiously, one with Turtle Bay written upon the top of its ponderer smiled and welcomed GoatVsFish. It was Comedian One Alyssa Price at Super Calilistic. The Super Cali Mama, it did call itself. "Is a turtle a goat or a fish?" cleverly asked GoatVsFish. And it was fish, for the Comedian One Alyssa Price did claim that a turtle was a fish. As the verses continued, this Super Cali Mama Comedian One claimed to have many tiny turtle fish of its own that depended on it for caring and love and supportliness. "Are you goat or are you fish?" "I was a goat," said the one, "but for the very survival of the fish, I must become a fish." "Are you fish? Are you fish?" asked GoatVsFish. "I am fish," said the fish, and Super Cali Mama Alyssa Price Comedian Turtlefish was a fish. It was a survival fish. It was a survival fish. What verses are these? What verses are these? That a goat does become a fish. And so it was GoatVsFish. It was GoatVsFish with the triumph of fishy conversion. Sorry, goat. Sorry, goat. The fish survives that so other fish may survive as well, to versus yet more goat. The fish thanked GoatVsFish. Always thank GoatVsFish for helping it in its fishy conversion from goat to fish. And the verses continued. Versing towards the place of the Comedy Store Belly Room again, Fish was feeling quite fish in its recent verses. And fishily, another fish approached GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish knew it was a fish without even having to ask if it was goat or fish. For Comedian One, Comedian Fish, Dave Yates at Yates Comedy, wore upon its very onesie the fish. It had the fish upon it, the visage of a very fish upon the Dave Yates one. And not just any fish, the PHISH fish. Yes, that fish. Hold the verses, said the fish. It is a celebration of fish. Fish, 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 oh, fish. You're trying to live a life that's completely free. You're racing in the sea, you swim and float. So have a couple verses of Mighty Goat. Oh, fish. You're trying to live a life that's completely free. You're racing in the sea, you swim and float. So have a couple verses of Mighty Goat. Fish, 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 fish. The fish celebration was ended. The fish celebration was ended, and Dave Yates Fish cried out, "Hot fish! Hot verses!" For the verses of that fish was that of the hot sauce, it did say, a fiery, saucy verses of fish that would make any goat tremble in anticipation of tasty verses of consumption. Leaving the verses now, some at the Comedy Store Los Angeles turned away from GoatVsFish, did avoid GoatVsFish. But I do not avoid GoatVsFish, said a spry, jumpety one that recognized GoatVsFish from prior verses. Are you goat or are you fish? It was a goat, it was a goat, it was the Sarah Lawrence goat that said it was a goat. Do you wish to verses with GoatVsFish and be on the GoatVsFish Instantgram, said GoatVsFish to Comedian One Sarah Lawrence at Imperial Music with the E being a 3, they do say. But the goat Sarah Lawrence did not have enough verses to verses the fish, for it had other verses to attend to. Many sought visages with goat Sarah Lawrence. But so did GoatVsFish, and a visage was had. Bearing the very teeth of the goat Sarah Lawrence serves as a celebratory verses to any fish that would dare to triumph over goat. Stare into the eyes of the Sarah Lawrence goat and see if you are prepared to verses. And GoatVsFish does declare, with 2 supreme triumphs of goat, 2 supreme triumphs of fish, the verses of the goat fish, a celebration of fish, and a quickly declaration of goat. But wait, the one cries out, what of the triple head-butting triumphs of goat? Oh yes, goat and fish, it is so. It is so. Though there is not an evidence on the Instantgram, for they did not wish to be on the GoatVsFish Instantgram. And though GoatVsFish does not speak of them until just now, in a surprise verses. There were in verses 2 further triumphs of headbutting goat. Headbutting verses after headbutting verses after headbutting verses, 3 verses in a verses. The fish did not ever seem to learn of the headbutting triumph of goat, and kept being triumphed by headbutting goat, until it did retaliate with a side fin in a fish verses. But the verses were done, and with secret triple headbutting triumphs. The goat do triumph at the verses of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. The goat do triumph over the fish. The goat do triumph over the fish. The grass-feeding verses of one goat were not so mighty, no, and the fish celebration of the hot fish just made the verses ever so slightly fish for fish. But with triple consecutive headbutting verses as they were, does secure goatly triumph, technically. There was also another fence-sitter that did speak at great verses to GoatVsFish about its own very fancy ponderings, troublesome fancy ponderings, but we do not need to get into those verses just now. Sorry, fish. There is always another verses. How does GoatVsFish know that there is always another verses? Goat versus Fish knows it, for Goat versus Fish did even wait in the middle of that verses to be on the verses of Killing Tony once more. But it was not to be. It was not to be. Goat versus Fish shall reverse at the killing of Tony. Shall reverse at the killing of Tony. Do you hear it? Do you hear it, one Tony Hinchcliffe, be you goat or fish? Killing Tony shall be Goat versus Fish. Killing Tony shall be Goat versus Fish. It is already Goat versus Fish, for in the verses of Killing of Tony, Goat versus Fish did hear the very sound of friendly goat. The very sound of friendly goat. Ah! 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 Do not deny it, Tony Hinchcliffe. Do not deny it, one Tony Hinchcliffe. The one that is called Brian Redban, who is not so welcoming to Goat versus Fish, does make the sound of a goat. Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. These are the verses of Goat vs. Fish of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Subscribe, rate, and review the Goat vs. Fish podcast on the YouTube and the iTunes. Follow Goat vs. Fish on all social media, on the Instagram, on the Book of Faces, on the Twitterver, and even on the Twitch, all at Goat vs. Fish, all at GoatVsFish. And if you wish to witness a live versus of Goat vs. Fish, to declare goat or fish to Goat vs. Fish, directly to Goat vs. Fish, go to GoatVsFish.com to find the places and times of all future verses. The theme celebration for this verses was an offering by McHenry, a fish on SoundCloud. And if you, one who listens, has a celebration of Goat vs. Fish, in song or poem or any other celebration, perhaps a question for Goat vs. Fish, do send it. Do send it on the social media or to Goat vs. Fish, that's GoatVsFish@gmail.com. Join the Goat vs. Fish discussion group on the Book of Faces to discuss Goat vs. Fish with other goat and fish. And when you are out in the land and the sea, look about you. Look about you. Find one who is lost. Find one who does not know the way. And ask. Simply ask. Are you goat? Or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. I am Goat vs. Fish, the Goat Fish. But at the end of the Goat vs. Fish podcast, we do say, and it was written, and it was written. Would you say this with Goat vs. Fish? It is up to you. It is up to you.
I'll give it one shot.
Yes.
And then, and that's it. If we don't get it right, we don't get it right, okay?
Yes, it shall be, yes. Here,
Okay.
Goat vs. Fish once more, yes? And it was written, and it was written.
Okay.
Goat vs. Fish.
And it was written, and it was written. The things I do for comedy.
Ah. What is one thing you hate about Goat vs. Fish?
Oh man, there's just one. Oh man, I don't like. One thing I hate about Goat vs. Fish, I don't like. I don't like the stickers.
Thank you. Thank you for being a part of Goat vs. Fish. Sincerely, Fence-Sitter. Thank you.
I will
yes.
say this. I do like, though, that this is like one really long deleted scene from Monty Python, The Holy Grail.
Is a python a goat or a fish? Find out on future verses of Goat vs. Fish.
Can I change my answer? Because I don't want to give you a shitty, like, just quick off-the-cuff response, because obviously that's an important question because you're clearly taking it from my podcast. I don't like how restrictive Goat vs. Fish is. I think it's way too, narrow, and that gives me anxiety, because I like possibility.